The Boy Who Lived. 4 words, not even a complete sentence, a fragment, one that will prove powerful and captivating. In its original context, it's a celebratory toast where everyone raises a glass to the boy who lived. It's the title of the first chapter in an epic series. It refers to one of the most famous heroes of our time. 14 letters, 4 little words, serve as a portal to an alternate reality parallel to our own, one filled with witches, wizards, a kindly half-giant, and a villain referred to as he who shall not be named. But about that boy, the one who lived, Harry Potter, with his father's unruly hair, his mother's green eyes, and a lightning bolt scar all his own. Harry Potter, the boy who lived in the cupboard under the stairs until leaving for Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the boy who took us on an amazing journey that ended in triumph and adulthood. What is it about him that is so special? In the history of storytelling, there must be thousands, hundreds of thousands of stories about boys who faced some great danger and lived. The American Indian, mixed blood orphan, Zitz, in Sherman Alexie's Flight, who at 15 gets shot in the head, travels through time, and by novel's end is miraculously restored and lives. Aristotle, not the philosopher, the Mexican-American teenager who gets hit by a car, saving the boy he loves and lives. In Benjamin Science's novel, Dante and Aristotle discover the secrets of the universe. And Keck, a Sudanese refugee who witnesses the brutal murders of his brother and father, who is separated from his mother and begins a new life in the alien landscape of a Minnesota winter in Catherine Applegate's home of the brave. And what about girls who live? Cece, who survives meningitis and comes to terms with her deafness by reimagining herself as the titular superhero El Defo in a graphic novel by Cece Bell. Katniss Everdeen, who is made to fight to the death repeatedly, survives and becomes the face of a revolution in Suzanne Collins's The Hunger Games series. Or smart, funny Marcy Cruz, who loves girls, but who endures physical and psychological abuse at the hands of her father until she escapes and lives. In Carlo Trujillo's What Night Brings. These stories all include children who live, though none of their stories have reached the height of popularity anywhere close to matching that of the boy wizard. So what is it about Harry Potter, the hero at the center of a global phenomenon? His story, imagined and penned by J.K. Rowling, has been translated into over 68 languages. That number does not include variations within the same language group, such as Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese. The first book in the series has also been translated into Latin and Ancient Greek, making the latter the longest published work in Ancient Greek since the 3rd century AD. Distributed to more than 200 territories, this 7-book epic has sold more than 450 million copies worldwide. 450 million. That's the approximate populations of the United States and Japan combined. How could one story appeal to so many people in so many languages, in so many different parts of the world? What could such a story teach us? And why is it worthy of study? Against the backdrop of a magical world, Harry and his friends, Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley, alongside their professors and allies, taught readers the importance of independent and critical thought, which, for example, won them extra points and Gryffindor the House Cup in the Sorcerer's Stone. They also taught us to reach beyond our own experiences, to make new friends, and learn about cultures different than our own, as they did during the Triwizard Tournament in the Goblet of Fire. Perhaps most importantly, they conveyed the value of research and information collecting as necessary for informed decision-making, as demonstrated by Hermione Granger in every book. All of these skills are rooted firmly in the humanities and are at the moral and ethical heart of a democracy. Dobby's enslavement, Malfoy's blood purity prejudice, the Longbottom's torture, and Dolores Umbridge's abuse of her position taught readers about social justice, the power of empathy, socioeconomic conflict, and the warranted skepticism of despotic authority figures. How could one incredible story reach so many different people? This story, which has been shared around the world, across generations, languages, genders, religious beliefs, and sexualities, has had an impact on ideas about cultural acceptance, diversity, equality, and political consciousness in ways that researchers are only starting to explore. To understand Harry Potter's current place in the cultural and literary landscapes, you need to know a little something about young adult fiction. It's a genre about which people have very decided views. The baby boom of 1992 created a large population of tween readers for the new millennium and initiated the contemporary golden age of young adult fiction. What most critics, scholars, and librarians do agree upon is the book helped to launch the current popularity of youth and young adult fiction. When we think about the crowds that gathered at midnight of all ages, waiting hours, some waiting days, the one thing they had in common is that they were all waiting for a book. Think about that. Everybody gathered, waiting for a single book, to be the first one to get that book, to read that book, and they would stay up all night doing so. When does that ever happen? And when will it happen again? Harry Potter was a unique phenomenon, one not likely to be replicated in our time. Though his story does have a striking similarity to a Skywalker of my generation, who's set to return next month. For 10 years, readers grew up alongside their protagonist, an experience that was extended 4 years through 8 films, which grossed more than $7.7 billion worldwide. The orphan who defeated a lingering and pervasive evil, who, along with his friends, his loyal friends, toppled a corrupt government ministry of magic to save the world. He is an irreplaceable hero for an entire generation. However, there is the inevitability. Inevitably, a new hero will emerge to capture our hearts and our imaginations, one that is yet to be written or already in press. But while some of us wait and others of us write, let us be mindful of the importance of greater diversity in young adult fiction as we search for a new generation of heroes and heroines who will take us on great adventures and live. Thank you.
It was called the Museion in Greek, museum, because it was dedicated to the muses, and thus arts, literature, and learning. It was also called the Serapeion, that is, a temple to the Egyptian god Osiris, called Serapis in Greek. It supposedly housed the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great, after whom the city had been named. Naturally, we're talking about the Library of Alexandria, greatest treasure trove of knowledge, literature, and culture in the ancient world. While it is etched in human memory, it is now merely a dream, for it was burned to the ground. Or so the story goes. Well, of course, Clive Cussler knows where it was taken. Treasure, 1988. As does Flynn Carson, the librarian, for those of you who follow these contemporary series. But we're going to go back to the real history here for a moment. And in point of fact, we don't actually know what happened completely to the ancient Library of Alexandria. The best scenario that we can suggest from the historical sources is that it was destroyed by rioting Christians in the year 391 in a violent cultural backlash against pagan monuments. Even so, we can't be absolutely sure that all the contents were destroyed at this point, and some things just kind of disappear in the mists of history. As a result, one scholar at least has cautioned with regard to all of this history that we're really talking about a library of dreams. But if we're somewhat uncertain about what ultimately happened to the library, its beginnings are even less clear. One tradition holds that it was founded by Ptolemy I, another by his son, Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, who ruled Egypt from 285 to 247 BC. And it's this legend that I want to talk about tonight, because it's also the legend that tells us how the Jewish scriptures came to be translated from Hebrew into Greek. This ancient text, called the Epistle of Aristeas, starts by talking about how copies of the Hebrew scriptures written in pure gold on fine parchment were sent by the high priest from Jerusalem at the request of Ptolemy II, along with 72 Jewish elders who would complete an authorized translation of the scriptures, one that would eventually come to be called the Septuagint, named after the Septuaginta, that is, the 70 translators. And in many ways, this Greek translation of the scriptures was one of the most important elements in Jewish tradition of all the Greco-Roman period, in large measure because most Jews of the Greco-Roman world no longer could speak, read, or write Hebrew. But if anything, the Septuagint became even more important in early Christian tradition because the Christians would eventually make this form of the Jewish scriptures part of their Greek Bible. So this is an extremely important tradition in the development of the biblical world. But here's the problem. The Epistle of Aristeas, for all its importance in both Jewish and Christian tradition, now appears to be entirely a fiction. So what do we do? Well, as a result, it has long been dismissed in biblical scholarship as an account of how the Septuagint came to be translated. And there are lots of very good reasons why on solid historical grounds. For example, there are glaring anachronisms in Ptolemaic court history and numerous other internal problems. Nor are we sure exactly when the work was actually written. It may come anywhere from the end of the 2nd century BC and as late as the early part of the 1st century AD. That is at about the time of the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher named Philo. But as such, we are now some 200 to 300 years after the events it purports to describe. Now, over the past century, the Epistle of Aristeas has largely been ignored in scholarship for just this very reason. But in ancient literature, the line between history and fiction is very fine. And I'd like to suggest that we can, in fact, gain important historical information from what are essentially fictional texts. Now, they may not tell us anything about the events, that is, they may not provide us with facts about what really happened. Nonetheless, they can tell us a lot about the times and the circumstances of those who wrote the stories and those who heard or read them. These are the tools and the goals of social, historical, and literary critical scholarship, and they help us to understand what's really going on by discerning both what did or did not really happen and why they told the stories the way that they did. This is what I've referred to in another context as the story of the storyteller's effect. So here's the story. The letter purports to be written by a certain Aristeas, who was a courtier or advisor to Ptolemy II, writing to his brother named Philocrates. It commences when the chief librarian of Ptolemy II, a man named Demetrius of Phalerum, announces that the library will soon reach 500,000 volumes. That's a staggering number for the ancient world. But he notes that they're missing copies of the ancient law books of the Jews. And so, on his recommendation, Ptolemy then writes a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem, a man named Eleazar, requesting both official copies of the scriptures and a battery of translators. Next, Aristeas himself is selected to lead the official delegation to Jerusalem. And here he gives a lengthy description of the lavish gifts sent by Ptolemy to the high priest, and then a description of Jerusalem and the temple, and finally of the high priest himself and his glorious vestments. Here is one of the key clues to the fictional nature of the work, because much of this description is actually dependent on the wording of the Greek of the Septuagint. In other words, the story comes well after the fact of the translation. Meanwhile, Demetrius, the librarian, who was in fact a real historical character, was in reality banished from the court of Ptolemy II within only 2 years of his accession and died soon thereafter. So there's not much that we can really draw from as far as history in all of this. Next, Aristeas and his entourage returned to Alexandria and introduced the translators at court. Ptolemy then welcomes his guests by throwing a 7-day banquet, in Greek, a symposium. And each evening during the dinner, he asked some of the Jewish elders a question, one at a time, generally on the qualities of a good king, a fitting subject for a symposium. In turn, each elder, without missing a beat, delivers a witty and insightful response, in Greek no less, blending elements of Greek philosophy with hints of Jewish theology. So then, by the end of the seventh night, they've given him 72 different maxims about kingship, philosophy, and virtue. Now, in fact, this is the longest single section of the entire work. All the way through, Ptolemy laughs and applauds with each of their responses, while his court philosophers, all eminent Greeks, praise their wit and wisdom. Finally, after all of this, the 72 elders are taken to a special retreat on the sacred island of Pharos, where they stay for 72 days and then emerge with 72 identical translations of the Jewish scriptures. Well, it's not hard to see that the work is basically fictitious and that the scriptures were already known in Greek well before it was written. Nor is it really about the library after all. A big part of what has not been noticed until recently is the fact that the whole story is couched as a typical Greek personal letter. It is thus given as though it were insider information from the respected courtier Aristeas to his younger brother, presumably. In the final analysis, this elaborate fiction, or what I would now call an epistolary novel, was probably written by a Jewish author for the Jews of Alexandria in the first century. Its intent then becomes much clearer as an apologetic. That is, as a charming and somewhat humorous testimonial to the value of Jewish tradition and the scriptures in Greek. In more symbolic ways, for the Jews of Alexandria, the story also bridges the gap between homeland and diaspora. As a result, it sounds very much like a hero tale for Jewish youth or young adults who are negotiating their own pathways into the larger world. I could even imagine Philo himself, a Jewish Platonist, writing such a tale for his very cultured brother Alexander, who would become the leader of the Jewish community in Alexandria. He was one of the richest men in the early Roman Empire and a confidant of the imperial family. Let me close then by reading one very short quotation from the letter in a new translation. It typifies this theme of Aristeas addressing his brother with these twin ideals of virtue and learning, the hallmark of the liberal arts and the humanities, after all. Now, Philocrates, I have attempted to give you a clear exposition of this matter, since I perceive what a disposition you possess for love of learning. For I'm convinced that with your inclination toward holiness, you will all the more readily follow them. And since you possess such a love of learning for those things that are able to benefit the mind, it is incumbent upon me to share these things, surely, with all those who have the same disposition. There's our real audience. But how much more with you, since you are not only my brother by kinship, but also in character, and share with us in the same impulse toward virtue. In the end, the Library of Alexandria is rather dreamlike here. It's a frame or a foil for this little morality tale. For these ancient Jews, God's holy law, instantiated in the Scriptures, and now also in their Greek translation, are the ultimate library. No wonder Philadelphus wanted copies for his library. And what greater testimonial for Jewish identity and experience. Thank you.